Before we begin, just take a moment. Maybe dim the lights a little. Let the room grow quieter. And if you're already lying down, just allow your body to settle. There's nothing you need to focus on, nothing you need to do. Tonight's story will move slowly, and you can simply listen or drift. And if you find yourself returning to these quiet journeys, night after night, you can subscribe. So this space is always here, waiting for you. Tonight, you wake up in a world that feels ordered. Everything around you seems calm, structured, predictable. The roads are straight, the measures are the same, the rules are clear. But beneath that order, something else exists. Something quieter. Something you don't speak about. You choose your words carefully, even in your own home, because you know that even silence can be dangerous. Somewhere not far from you, someone made a mistake. Maybe they said the wrong thing. Maybe they failed to report something. And now they are gone. No one talks about it. But everyone knows this is not chaos. This is not war. This is something else. A system. One that watches, one that records, one that decides, and tonight, we step slowly into that world to understand not just how it worked, but what it felt like to live inside it. We are now in the early years of the first unified empire of China, under the rule of Qin Shi Huang. This system was designed to last forever. Every law, every road, every movement of every person within it, carefully measured, carefully controlled. Nothing was left to chance. And for a time, it worked perfectly. But something about it was already beginning to fail, not loudly, not visibly, but quietly from within. You find yourself standing within that system now, not as an observer, but as someone moving inside it. The air feels still, ordered, almost too precise. Each sound arrives where it should. Each movement fits into place, as if everything around you has already been decided, long before you arrived. This is the world shaped under Qin Shi Huang, a world where chaos has been removed, replaced by structure, replaced by control, replaced by something that does not bend. You begin to move slowly, without urgency. There is no need to rush here. Everything unfolds at the same steady pace. People pass by, their steps measured, their voices low. Nothing stands out, and that is exactly the point. Because in this place, nothing is meant to stand out. Everything belongs to the system, and the system belongs to itself. You continue forward, following a path that feels less like a choice and more like something already decided. Stone beneath your feet, warm, unmoving. Walls rising around you, steady, silent. There is no sense of randomness, no sense of interruption, only continuation, only repetition, only a pattern. That does not need to change. At first, it feels stable, comforting, even, because nothing unexpected happens, nothing breaks, nothing resists. But as you move deeper into it, something begins to feel slightly off. Not enough to stop you, not enough to understand, but enough to be felt. A quiet absence, where something should be, you cannot name it, and the system does not allow you to. It continues, as if nothing is missing, as if nothing is wrong, and you continue with it, because there is no clear moment where you would choose not to. The system does not ask for your attention, it assumes it already has it. You move with it, not because you are forced, but because there is no clear alternative. Each step follows the last. Each moment leads into the next, without interruption, without hesitation. Around you, life continues in the same measured way. Workers carry materials, and across wide stone paths, their movement steady, repeated countless times, not rushed, not delayed, simply continuing. A cart rolls past, wooden wheels pressing into the ground with a soft, consistent rhythm. No one looks at you for long, no one needs to, because within this system, no individual moment holds more weight than another. Everything blends, everything aligns, everything becomes part of something larger. You begin to notice how little is left to chance, how even the smallest actions seem guided, directed, contained. This is not chaos shaped into order. This is order that has removed chaos entirely, and yet that same order begins to feel heavier, not physically, but somewhere beneath the surface, a subtle pressure that does not push, but does not release. You continue moving, because everything around you continues. A line of soldiers passes in the distance, their formation precise, their presence quiet, not imposing, but absolute. They do not need to act. Their existence alone is enough to remind you that nothing here exists outside the system, and nothing within it moves freely. At first, you might not question this, because everything works, everything holds, everything remains exactly as it should, but slowly, almost too slowly to notice, that same perfection begins to feel incomplete, as if something essential has been removed. In order to create it, you cannot see what is missing, and yet you can feel the space where it should be. The system does not acknowledge this. It does not adjust. It does not respond. It continues exactly as it was designed to, and you continue within it, because nothing is broken, nothing has failed, nothing has given you a reason to stop. At first, it does not feel like anything important is changing. The land still holds its divisions. The states remain where they have always been, and the rhythm of life continues without any clear break or interruption. You move through familiar paths, hearing the same stories of conflict, seeing the same guarded borders, feeling the same uncertainty that has always shaped how people live. But over time, something begins to stand out, not suddenly, not in a way that demands attention, but in a quiet shift that becomes harder to ignore the longer you remain within it. In certain regions, the movement of life feels different. Not calmer, not easier, but more controlled, as though each action fits into a pattern that does not change as easily as before. You begin to notice that within these places, responses are more predictable, that behavior follows clear expectations, and that the consequences of deviation are more certain. This difference is not explained to you. You feel it. In the way people move, in the way they hesitate less, in the way space itself feels shaped by intention rather than reaction. Within the state of Qin state, this pattern holds more firmly than in the regions around it, not because it avoids conflict, but because it contains it, organizing it within a structure that does not easily shift. The system here does not rely on tradition alone, nor does it leave space for interpretation in the same way as other states. Instead, it defines behavior through clear rules, applied consistently, reducing the uncertainty that exists elsewhere. You walk along roads that feel more direct, not winding without purpose, but leading from one point to another with intention. And even without knowing why, you begin to sense that movement here is not left to chance. The presence of authority is not always visible in people, but it is visible in order, in repetition, in how little things deviate from what is expected. Over many seasons, as this pattern continues, the difference between Qin and other states becomes clearer, not through sudden displays of power, but through the steady consistency of its structure. You may hear that its laws are strict, that its punishments are certain, that its expectations leave little room for variation. But what you experience is something quieter, a system that holds, a pattern that does not break. Within this environment, people do not need to constantly adjust to shifting conditions, because the conditions themselves remain stable long enough to be learned. This does not make life easier, but it makes it predictable. And over time, predictability begins to shape behavior more strongly than uncertainty ever could. You notice that actions lead to results in ways that can be anticipated, that responses follow patterns that do not change without reason, and that the space between decision and consequence feels shorter. The body reacts differently in such a place. Less hesitation, fewer pauses, movement that flows more directly from one action to the next, not because there is freedom, but because there is clarity. Within this system, control is not only enforced, it is internalized, shaping how people think, how they respond, and how they move through the world. And because it is consistent, it does not need to assert itself constantly. It simply continues. As more time passes, this consistency begins to extend outward, not in sudden expansion, but in gradual influence, as Qin's structure comes into contact with regions that are less stable. You begin to feel this shift even before you fully understand it, as areas that once required constant awareness begin to settle into more predictable patterns. There is less variation, less uncertainty, less need to adapt, and in its place, something steadier, something more controlled. Within this process, power changes in how it is expressed, no longer scattered across many shifting centers, but beginning to gather, to hold, to move in a more focused direction. You continue to move within this world, but the difference becomes harder to ignore. How some places still shift unpredictably, while others begin to follow a pattern that does not break. The contrast grows clearer over time, not because one replaces the other immediately, but because one remains while the other continues to change. Within Qin, that stability does not weaken. It holds through pressure, through time, through repetition. And because it holds, it begins to shape everything around it. You may not see the full extent of what is forming, but you begin to sense its direction, how movement across the land is no longer entirely scattered, how something is beginning to guide it. There is no single moment where this becomes obvious, no clear point where everything changes, only a gradual shift, felt rather than announced. And as this shift continues slowly, steadily, across many seasons, the idea of a world divided begins to loosen, not disappearing, but being pulled towards something more unified, something that does not rely on variation, but on consistency, something that does not shift, but holds. And as you remain within this movement, following the same paths, feeling the same changes, watching the same patterns repeat, you begin to understand that this is not simply another state becoming stronger. It is something different, something that does not adapt to the world around it, but reshapes it. It does not begin with a single moment that you can point to. There is no clear signal, no announcement that everything is about to change. Only a gradual shift in how movement across the land starts to feel. You begin to hear it first, not as a story but as fragments, reports carried between regions, quiet mentions of one state advancing, not once, but again and again. At first, it sounds like something familiar, another conflict among many, another attempt to push beyond a border that will eventually push back. But this time, the pattern does not reverse. Within Qin, movement is no longer contained, and the system that once held its territory steady begins to extend outward, not in scattered efforts, but in a sequence that feels deliberate. The structure that shaped daily life within its borders now shapes how it advances, organized, consistent, and difficult to disrupt once it begins. You notice the difference in how news travels, how each report does not contradict the last, but adds to it, building a direction rather than scattering into uncertainty. One region falls, then another, not suddenly, but without returning to how things were before. As this continues, the rhythm of conflict changes, no longer shifting between many centers, but moving in a line, step by step, pushing forward without breaking. You feel it in the tension that begins to settle across the land, not sharp, not chaotic, but steady, as though something is moving closer, even when it is still far away. In places untouched by Qin, life continues as it has, but there is a difference now, a quiet awareness that the balance is no longer holding in the same way. People speak less confidently about boundaries, less certain that what exists today will remain unchanged tomorrow. Within Qin, the movement does not slow, not because resistance is absent, but because resistance is absorbed into a system that does not lose its shape under pressure. Each advance follows the same pattern, not improvisation, not reaction, but execution, carried out in a way that feels almost inevitable once it begins. You may not see the battles themselves, but you see their results, regions that no longer function as they once did, spaces where the structure has changed without returning to its previous form. There is no pause long enough to restore what was there before. Only continuation, only the next movement forward. The environment begins to reflect this shift. Roads that once marked division now carry movement in a single direction, and areas that once stood apart begin to lose that separation. You travel through places that feel different, not destroyed, but reorganized, as though they have been brought into alignment with something larger than themselves. Within this process, Qin does not simply take territory. It replaces the systems within it, reshaping how people move, how they act, and how they understand authority. This is not a temporary change. It holds, and because it holds, it spreads. Over time, the number of independent states begins to shrink, not all at once, but steadily, each loss remaining, each change becoming part of what continues forward. You begin to notice that names once spoken frequently are no longer mentioned in the same way, not because they are forgotten, but because they no longer exist as they did before. There is no clear moment to mark their end, only the absence that follows. and the continuation of what replaces them. Within Qin's expansion, there is little variation in how this process unfolds. The same structure applied again and again, reducing uncertainty, maintaining direction. You start to understand that this is not simply strength, it is consistency, a form of power that does not depend on a single moment, but on the ability to repeat without breaking. The body reacts to this shift in a quiet way, a tension that does not spike, but lingers, as though something is approaching that cannot be avoided simply by waiting. There are fewer places left where the old patterns still hold, fewer regions untouched by this steady movement, and more spaces where the new structure has already taken root. You move through a world that feels like it is narrowing, not physically, but in possibility, as variation gives way to something more uniform. The difference between regions becomes less pronounced, not because they are unchanged, but because they are being brought into the same pattern. Within this process, time itself begins to feel different, no longer marked by shifting alliances and unpredictable change, but by a steady progression that does not turn back. You begin to sense that this movement is not temporary, not something that will reverse once balance is restored, because balance is no longer the direction. Completion is, there is a moment, quiet and difficult to define, when you realize that the world you knew is not simply changing, it is ending, not through collapse, but through replacement, and what takes its place does not scatter, it holds, across distance, across time, across everything it touches. As the final states begin to fall, not all at once, but in the same steady pattern that has defined everything before, the shape of the land changes in a way that cannot be undone. There are no longer many centers of power, only one, not because it appeared suddenly, but because it continued, long enough, without breaking, until nothing else remained beside it. At first, it does not feel like victory. There is no single moment where everything becomes calm, no clear line where conflict ends and something new fully begins. Only a quiet shift in how the world holds together. You move through places that once felt separate, once defined by their own rules, their own patterns, their own way of continuing. Now, those differences begin to fade, not completely, but enough that the boundaries between them no longer feel as strong as they once did. The roads stretch farther without interruption, connecting regions that once stood apart, and the movement across them feels less uncertain, as though direction has replaced hesitation. You walk along these paths and notice how the journey changes. Fewer stops, fewer adjustments, fewer moments where you must reconsider how to move forward. Within this new structure, authority no longer shifts depending on where you stand, but remains consistent, extending across distance in a way that was not present before. The system does not announce itself loudly. It is simply there, holding everything in place. You begin to notice it in small details, the way measures are standardized, the way writing becomes more uniform, the way communication travels with fewer interruptions. Things that once required interpretation now follow clearer patterns, and because of that, movement feels more direct, more predictable, more continuous. The environment reflects this change. Markers appear along roads. Boundaries feel less like divisions and more like extensions of the same space, and the land itself begins to feel connected. You move through regions that no longer resist each other in the same way. where the sense of separation has softened, replaced by something more aligned. Over time, this alignment becomes familiar, not because it is explained, but because it repeats, shaping how people think about distance, about movement, about where they belong. The body responds to this consistency in a quiet way. Less tension when crossing into new areas, fewer moments of uncertainty, a steadier rhythm in how you move from one place to another. It does not feel easier, but it feels clearer. Within this unified structure under Qin Shi Huang, the system does not rely on variation between regions, but reduces it, bringing different places into the same pattern. What once depended on local rule now follows a broader order, one that applies regardless of where you stand, shaping behavior across the entire land. You begin to notice how expectations remain the same, even as the environment changes. How actions lead to similar outcomes no matter the distance traveled. This consistency removes the need for constant adjustment, but replaces it with something else, something more fixed, something that does not change easily. Daily life continues, but it follows a different rhythm now, one that is less reactive and more defined, where the sequence of actions feels established rather than uncertain. You wake, you move, you work, but the pattern feels less dependent on external change, and more guided by something that remains stable beneath it. The difference is subtle, but it grows clearer with time. As the repetition of this pattern begins to shape not only behavior, but expectation. You no longer prepare for sudden shifts in authority, no longer adjust to entirely different systems when moving across regions. Instead, you move within something continuous, something that holds. The sound of daily activity reflects this as well. Less variation in how tasks are carried out. Fewer interruptions caused by uncertainty, and a steadier flow that carries through the day. People move with less hesitation, not because they are freer, but because the structure around them leaves less room for variation. Within this system, clarity replaces uncertainty, but it also reduces the space for deviation, shaping behavior into forms that align more closely with expectation. You may not think of it as control, but you feel its presence. In the way movement becomes predictable, in the way responses become consistent, in the way the day unfolds without needing to adapt. Over time, this consistency begins to define how the world is understood, not as a collection of separate regions, but as a single space, held together by patterns that do not break. You move through it without needing to question where one system ends and another begins, because there is no longer a clear boundary between them. There is a moment, quiet and easily missed, when you realize that the world feels smaller, not in size, but in variation, as though the differences that once defined it have been drawn into something more uniform. This does not come with a strong reaction, no sense of loss, no sense of gain, only recognition that things no longer shift in the same way. Within this unified structure, time itself begins to feel more consistent, no longer shaped by sudden changes in power, but by patterns that continue without interruption. Days follow each other with fewer surprises, and the rhythm of life settles into a form that does not require constant adjustment. You continue to move within it, following the same paths, repeating the same actions, feeling the same structure holding everything together. And as this repetition continues, across many days and many seasons, The difference between what once was and what now exists becomes harder to recall. Not because it is gone, but because it no longer defines how the world moves. The land remains the same, but the way it is held together has changed, and within that change, everything continues in the same way, without breaking. At first, the rules do not feel new. They are already there, woven into the way people move, the way they speak, the way they respond without needing to question what is expected of them. You begin to notice them not as instructions, but as limits, quiet boundaries that shape behavior long before anyone needs to explain them. A gesture stops slightly earlier than it might have before. A response comes more quickly, without hesitation, and even small actions seem to follow a pattern that leaves little space for variation. There is no moment where someone tells you that things are different. You understand it through repetition, through what is allowed and what is not. Within the unified system under Qin Shi Huang, control is no longer something that appears only in moments of conflict, but something that continues quietly, shaping daily life without needing to be constantly enforced. The structure of law does not shift depending on where you stand, nor does it change based on circumstance. Instead, it remains consistent, applying the same expectations across distance. You move through your day and begin to feel how this consistency works, how actions lead to outcomes that are not uncertain, but defined, reducing the need to guess what might happen next. This clarity does not remove pressure. It refines it, turning uncertainty into something more direct. Around you, the environment reflects this order, not in obvious displays, but in how little things deviate, how movement aligns, and how rarely patterns break once they begin. Even when no one is watching closely, behavior follows the same structure. Not because it must be forced, but because it has become familiar enough to continue on its own. You begin to sense that the system does not rely only on presence, but on expectation, on the understanding that actions carry consequences that do not change. Within this pattern, hesitation becomes less common, not because people are free from doubt, but because the outcome of certain choices is already clear. The body reacts to this in a quiet way. Movements become more direct, pauses shorter, decisions made with less visible uncertainty, not because they are easier, but because they are already defined. Over time, this clarity shapes how people think, how they respond, and how they understand their place within the structure that surrounds them. You may not speak about it, but you feel it, in the way conversations remain measured, in the way actions stay within expected limits, in the way deviation does not extend far before it is corrected. The system does not need to repeat itself. It holds through consistency. Within this structure, law is not distant, not something that appears only in rare moments, but something present in every action, guiding behavior, even when it is not directly observed. You move through your work as before, lifting, placing, repeating, but the rhythm now carries a sharper edge, a sense that each movement fits within a defined space. There is less room to adjust, less space to interpret, only continuation within the pattern that has already been set. The sound of daily life reflects this as well. Fewer interruptions caused by uncertainty, fewer unexpected shifts, and a steadier flow that continues without breaking. Everything moves, but within limits, within lines that are not always visible, but always present. As more time passes, this structure becomes easier to follow, not because it changes, but because it remains the same, allowing behavior to align with it without constant effort. You begin to understand that control here is not only external, it is internal, shaping how people act even when no one is watching. Within this system, punishment is not the only force that maintains order, but it is the certainty of consequence that gives the system its strength. Actions do not exist without outcome, and outcomes do not change without reason. This creates a form of stability that does not depend on trust, but on predictability, where behavior aligns not because it is chosen freely, but because deviation carries a known result. You feel this in small moments, when a thought to act differently arises and then fades, not because it is impossible, but because the result is already understood. There is no need to test it, no need to explore it. It passes, and the pattern continues. Around you, others move in the same way, not identical, but aligned, following expectations that remain consistent across time and place. The difference between individuals becomes less visible in action, not because it disappears, but because behavior follows the same structure. Within this environment, the system no longer needs to assert itself loudly. It is already present, in repetition, in expectation, in every movement that continues without breaking the pattern. As the day moves forward, and as the rhythm carries you from one task to the next, there is no clear moment where control appears, because it is already there, holding everything in place, not through force alone, but through consistency, through clarity, through a structure that does not change. And as you continue within it, repeating the same actions, following the same rhythm, feeling the same limits shaping what you do, you begin to understand that this is not simply law. It is a way of living, one that does not shift, one that does not loosen, one that continues. In the same way, across everything it touches, you begin to notice it in the moments when nothing is said, not in commands, not in visible enforcement, but in the way people adjust themselves slightly, as though something unseen is already present before any action is taken. A conversation stops just short of what it might have been. A glance lingers for a fraction of a second longer than expected, and then everything continues as if nothing had almost happened. It does not feel like fear in the way you might expect. It feels quieter, more controlled, as though the possibility of consequence exists before the action itself. Within the unified system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, observation is not always direct, but it is assumed, becoming part of how people move, how they speak, and how they decide what not to say. The structure does not rely on constant visible presence, but on the understanding that behavior is seen, recorded, and remembered, even when no one appears to be watching closely. You begin to sense this in your own movements, a slight tightening in how you act, a small adjustment in how you respond, as though each action is being measured against something that does not need to be explained. Around you, others move with the same subtle awareness, not stopping, not hesitating completely, but shaping their behavior within limits that feel understood without being stated. There is no need for repeated instruction. The pattern holds on its own. The environment reflects this quiet control, not through obvious surveillance, but through how consistently behavior aligns, how rarely actions move beyond what is expected. Even in spaces that seem open, Movement follows the same rhythm. Conversations remain within certain boundaries, and silence carries more weight than before. You begin to understand that observation here is not only external, it is internal, guiding behavior before it becomes visible. The body reacts in small ways, a slight tension that settles into your posture, a controlled pace in your movement, a sense that even stillness has a shape it must follow. These changes do not interrupt the flow of daily life. They refine it, narrowing what is possible into what is acceptable. Within this structure, people are not isolated from one another, but connected through shared responsibility, where actions do not exist alone, but carry consequences that extend beyond the individual. You become aware that behavior is not only judged by authority, but by those around you, creating a network of observation that does not require constant enforcement to remain active. This does not feel like constant scrutiny. It feels like alignment, as though everyone understands the limits and moves within them without needing to test where they end. Over time, this awareness becomes quieter, not because it disappears, but because it becomes familiar, part of the rhythm that continues without interruption. You no longer think about being observed in a direct way. You act as though observation is always possible, and that is enough. The sound of daily life carries this shift. Conversations remain measured, pauses are shorter, and actions follow patterns that do not break easily. There are fewer moments of unpredictability, fewer instances where behavior moves beyond what is expected, and more continuity in how people respond. Within this environment, pressure does not come from sudden force, but from consistency, from the certainty that deviation does not go unnoticed, even when it is not immediately addressed. You feel this most clearly in moments where a different action is possible, where a response could move outside the pattern, and then it does not. Not because it cannot, but because it is not taken. There is a brief awareness, and then it passes, and the pattern continues. Around you, others follow the same rhythm, not perfectly, but closely enough that the structure remains intact, supported by behavior that aligns without needing to be directed. This creates a form of stability that is not visible in a single place, but exists across the entire system, and carried by the actions of those within it. You begin to understand that control here is not only maintained by law, but by expectation, by the shared awareness that actions have consequences that extend beyond the immediate moment. Within this pattern, individuality does not disappear, but it becomes less visible in action, as behavior conforms to structures that remain consistent across time. The difference between what you think and what you do becomes more defined, not because thought is restricted, but because action follows a path that has already been shaped. You continue through your day, repeating the same movements, following the same rhythm, feeling the same quiet limits shaping how you respond. And over time, this repetition becomes easier, not because it loosens, but because it remains the same. There is no need to test it, no need to push against it, only continuation, only alignment. As the day moves toward its quiet pause, and the rhythm slows just enough to mark the passing of time, there is no clear moment where pressure lifts. Because it does not lift, it remains steady, unspoken, present in every movement that continues within the pattern. And as you remain within it, following the same paths, responding in the same ways, Feeling the same structure shaping what you do, you begin to understand. That observation here is not something that happens occasionally. It is something that exists constantly, quietly, without needing to be seen. It begins as work, nothing more than the continuation of what has already been established. The structure is in place. The system holds. And what remains is the effort required to sustain it, carried out day after day without interruption. You move into the rhythm without needing instruction, your body already familiar with the sequence, the repetition settling in before the day has fully begun. The first movements feel manageable, lifting, placing, adjusting, each action following the last in a pattern that does not require thought. There is a steadiness to it at the beginning, a sense that the work is contained within what you can carry, what you can repeat, what you can endure for the time being. But as the day continues, that sense begins to shift, not suddenly, not in a way that forces you to stop, but in a gradual weight that builds without announcing itself. The air grows heavier, the motion slower, the space between each breath slightly longer than before. You continue, because stopping is not part of the pattern. Around you, others move in the same way, not synchronized, but close enough that the rhythm becomes shared. A continuous flow that does not pause even as effort increases. The sound of work fills everything, tools striking, materials shifting, footsteps pressing into the ground, creating a steady repetition that does not break. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, labor is not organized around comfort, but around completion, where the continuation of work matters more than how it feels in any single moment. You begin to understand this not through instruction, but through experience, as the pattern does not adjust to fatigue, does not slow when effort increases, does not change based on how your body responds. The movement continues at the same pace, with the same expectation, without variation. The body reacts in ways that are difficult to ignore, a tightening in the muscles, a steady pull in the arms and shoulders, a sense that each action requires slightly more effort than the one before. But the difference is small enough to carry, small enough to continue, and so you do. Over time, the repetition becomes heavier, not because it changes, but because it does not. The same motion repeated again and again until it begins to feel less like separate actions and more like a single, continuous strain. You adjust without thinking, shifting weight, altering your grip, finding small ways to continue without breaking the rhythm. There is no moment where the work stops to allow recovery, only brief pauses that do not fully interrupt the pattern, and then movement again. Around you, the number of people makes the scale of the effort clear, lines extending beyond what you can easily see, groups moving in parallel, each carrying out their part within something much larger. The structure rises slowly, not through sudden change, but through accumulation, each action adding to something that does not yet feel complete, but already feels vast. You look up for a moment, just long enough to take in the distance, the continuation of the work beyond your immediate space, and then you return, because the pattern does not hold space for observation, only continuation. Within the system, effort is not measured in moments, but in duration, in how long the work continues rather than how it feels at any single point. You begin to feel time differently, not marked by clear transitions, but by the repetition of movement, one action blending into the next without a distinct boundary. The beginning of the day feels distant. The end remains unclear. Everything in between becomes part of the same continuous motion. The body adapts in small ways, learning how to conserve energy, how to maintain the rhythm without fully breaking under it. But adaptation does not remove the strain. It allows it to continue. There is a moment, brief and difficult to hold, when you become fully aware of the weight, not just in your hands, but across your entire body. A realization that the effort is not temporary, not limited to a single day. And then it passes, because the movement continues, and awareness does not change the pattern. Around you, the same process unfolds, each person carrying their part, not independently, but within a system that connects every action into a larger whole. No single movement defines the work, only the continuation of all of them together. This is where the scale becomes undeniable, not only in what is being built, but in how many are required to sustain it. How many actions must repeat without interruption for it to hold. You begin to understand that the work is not designed to end quickly, not meant to be completed within a short span, but to continue, extending across time in a way that does not depend on any single effort. The rhythm does not change. The expectation does not shift. Only the accumulation grows. As the day moves forward and the motion continues without pause, the body reaches a point where effort no longer feels separate from movement. It becomes the movement, something carried forward without needing to be questioned, without needing to be reconsidered. And as this continues across many days and then many more, the repetition begins to define not only what you do, but how you experience the passing of time, not as separate moments, but as a single, extended effort. That does not break. That does not stop. That continues in the same way, until the distinction between beginning and end becomes difficult to feel. At some point, so do you begin to notice the distance, not in how far you travel, but in how far the work continues beyond you, stretching outward in ways that are difficult to measure from where you stand. You lift your head for a brief moment, just enough to see beyond your immediate task, and what you notice is not a single effort, but a line, then another, and another, each carrying the same motion forward. It does not end where you expect it to. It continues, fading into distance without fully disappearing. The movement around you feels the same as it always has. The same repetition, the same effort, the same rhythm carried through each action. But the meaning of that movement begins to change, not because the task is different, but because of how many others are doing it at the same time. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, labor is not isolated, not limited to a single place, but extended across regions, connecting efforts into something that grows far beyond any one person's reach. You begin to understand this not through explanation, but through scale, through the way the work continues even when you are not looking at it directly. The sound carries farther than before, not just from those beside you, but from lines that stretch beyond your view, creating a steady presence that does not fade. It is not loud, but it is constant. And because it is constant, it becomes difficult to ignore. Over time, the sense of distance shifts, not because the space changes, but because your awareness of it grows, expanding outward from your own position to include what lies beyond it. You begin to feel that your movement is not separate. You're not defined only by what you do, but connected to something that continues whether you are aware of it or not. The body continues its work as before, lifting, placing, repeating, but there is a subtle change in how that effort is understood, a quiet realization that what you carry is only a small part of something much larger. This does not arrive suddenly. It builds, gradually, through repetition. You look again, briefly, and notice how each group moves in a similar rhythm, not perfectly aligned, but close enough that the pattern holds across distance. No single motion stands out. No single effort defines the whole. Only continuation. Only accumulation. Within this structure, scale is not expressed through size alone, but through repetition across many, through the ability to sustain the same pattern across countless actions. You begin to understand that the work does not depend on any one person, not because individuals are unimportant, but because the system is designed to continue regardless. This realization does not interrupt your movement. You continue, because the pattern continues. Around you, the same process unfolds. People moving in lines that extend beyond sight. Actions repeating in ways that do not change even as the distance grows. The environment begins to feel different. Not because it is unfamiliar, but because it is larger than it once seemed. Filled with activity that does not center around you. You move within it, but you are not at its center. You are part of it, and it continues without needing to return to you. There is a moment, quiet and brief, when this becomes clear, not as a thought fully formed, but as a feeling that settles without needing to be explained. That what you are doing matters, but not in a way that changes the direction of everything around you. The body reacts subtly, not stopping, not slowing, but carrying the movement forward with a different awareness, one that does not resist a scale but exists within it. You adjust your grip, your posture, your pace, not to change the work, but to continue within it, because continuation is the only direction that holds. The sound of labor continues without interruption, spreading across space in a way that does not break, reinforcing the sense that the pattern is larger than any single point within it. It does not depend on visibility. It does not depend on attention. It simply continues. Over many days, and then many more, this awareness becomes familiar, not overwhelming but steady, part of how the work is experienced rather than something separate from it. You no longer look for an edge or an end, because neither is easily found. Within this system, scale removes the need for individual distinction in action, not by force, but by the way repetition aligns behavior across many people at once. You move in the same rhythm as those around you, not because you are directed to, but because the pattern allows little variation once it is established. The difference between one person and another becomes less visible in movement, not because it disappears, but because it follows the same structure. There is no moment where this becomes complete, no clear point where the scale is fully understood, only a gradual shift, where awareness expands, and the sense of position within it becomes quieter. You continue your work, feeling the same weight, repeating the same motion, but now within a space that feels larger, more extended, more continuous than before. The distinction between what is near and what is far becomes less important because the pattern remains the same regardless of distance. And within that pattern, everything holds together, not through a single effort, but through all of them, repeated, without breaking, without stopping, without needing to be seen. And as you remain within it, moving as you have always moved, following the same rhythm, carrying the same effort forward, you begin to understand that what surrounds you is not simply large, it is sustained. And because it is sustained, it does not depend on any one part, including you. It does not appear all at once. There is no single moment where the cost becomes clear, no point where everything stops long enough for it to be fully seen. Only small changes that pass quietly through the rhythm of each day. You continue as before, following the same movement, repeating the same actions, and at first, nothing seems different enough to draw your attention. The work holds, the pattern continues. Everything appears to remain in place. But over time, something begins to shift in a way that is easy to miss if you are not already looking for it. A space in the line that takes slightly longer to fill, a familiar presence that no longer returns, a movement that continues without the person who once carried it. These changes do not interrupt the rhythm. They are absorbed by it. The work adjusts, not by stopping, but by continuing, filling what is no longer there, without altering the pattern that holds everything together. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, continuation remains more important than interruption, and anything that does not continue is quietly replaced by you notice this not through explanation, but through repetition, as the same process occurs again, not always in the same place, not always involving the same people, but often enough to become familiar. Someone is no longer beside you, and the next day, the work continues. There is no moment set aside to acknowledge the absence, no pause within the structure that allows it to settle into something that can be held. The pattern moves forward, and because it moves forward, it does not look back. The body continues its effort as before, lifting, placing, repeating. But there is a quiet awareness that begins to form beneath that movement, something that does not interrupt action, but exists alongside it. That what is present now may not remain, and that when it changes, nothing around it will stop. This realization does not arrive as a strong emotion. It settles, softly, becoming part of how the work is understood. Around you, others continue in the same way, not reacting visibly, not slowing, not stepping outside the rhythm that holds everything together. It is not that they do not notice, it is that noticing does not change what follows. Within this environment, loss does not take the form of disruption, but of absence, quiet, unmarked, and quickly absorbed into the continuation of the system. You may recall small details, a voice, a movement, a shared rhythm that once existed beside you, and now does not. But there's no place within the day to hold that memory fully. Only the next action. Only the continuation of what must be done. Over time, this pattern becomes easier to follow, not because the loss disappears, but because it is not given space to remain separate from what continues. You adjust without thinking, shifting your position, carrying the same effort forward, allowing the pattern to absorb what is no longer present. The environment reflects this in a subtle way. No visible markers of change, no clear sign that something has been altered, only the steady continuation of the same movement across the same space. It becomes difficult to point to what has changed, because everything still moves, everything still continues. The sound of work does not lessen, the rhythm does not slow, and the pattern remains intact, even as the elements within it shift. You begin to understand that the system does not resist loss. It incorporates it, allowing what remains to continue without interruption. This creates a form of stability that does not depend on preservation, but on replacement, on the ability to maintain the pattern regardless of what changes within it. The body carries this understanding in a quiet way, not stopping, not reacting outwardly, but continuing with a steadiness that does not break. There is no moment where the work pauses to reflect, no space where the change is fully acknowledged, only movement, only continuation. As more days pass, and then many more, this process repeats, not dramatically, not in a way that draws attention, but steadily, becoming part of how the system functions. You no longer expect things to remain the same, but you also do not expect the pattern to change. Within this structure, what continues defines what matters, and what does not continue is left behind without altering the direction of everything else. There is a moment, brief and difficult to hold, when you recognize this fully, not as a thought, but as a feeling that settles beneath the surface of what you are doing, that the system does not depend on any single presence, that it continues, regardless, and then the moment passes, because the work continues, and awareness does not change the pattern. You return to the same motion, the same rhythm, the same sequence that carries everything forward, not because nothing has changed, but because change does not interrupt what continues. And as you remain within that movement, repeating the same actions, feeling the same structure holding everything in place, you begin to understand that the cost of what surrounds you is not visible in a single moment. It exists in what is no longer there, and in how everything continues without it. After a while, it no longer feels like something is happening. The pattern has continued for long enough that it does not stand out, does not draw attention to itself, and does not feel separate from the way things are meant to be. You move through the same rhythm as before, but there is a difference now, not in what you do, but in how it feels to do it. The work remains, the structure holds, but the sense of change begins to fade. Where there was once awareness, there is now familiarity, and what once required adjustment now happens without it, as though the pattern has settled into place. You wake, you move, you continue, and there is no moment where you stop to consider whether it could be different. Not because it cannot, but because it no longer occurs to you. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, consistency has remained long enough to become expectation, and expectation has remained long enough to become routine. The structure does not need to assert itself in the same way, because it is already present in the rhythm of daily life, guiding behavior without needing to be noticed. You begin to feel this in small ways, a reduction in hesitation, a quiet certainty in how each action follows the next, a sense that the path is already set before you begin to move. There is less need to question, less need to adjust, only continuation. Around you, others move with the same ease, not because the work has become lighter, but because the pattern has become familiar enough to carry itself. The sound of daily activity reflects this shift, smoother, more consistent, fewer interruptions, fewer moments where the rhythm breaks or changes direction. Even silence feels different, not as absence, but as part of the pattern, something that fits within the structure rather than standing outside of it. You notice that conversations have changed, not in what is said, but in what is not. Fewer words that move beyond expectation. Fewer moments where thought turns into something that must be spoken. This is not enforced directly. It is understood. And because it is understood, it does not need to be repeated. Over time, the difference between what you choose and what is expected becomes less clear. Not because choice disappears, but because it aligns more closely with the structure that surrounds it. You continue through the same sequence, repeating the same actions, but the sense of performing them as decisions begins to fade. They happen because they are what happens. The body responds in a quieter way, less tension and anticipation, fewer pauses before movement, a steadiness that carries through each action without interruption. Not because the effort is gone, but because it is no longer resisted. Within this environment, normalization does not arrive as a moment of acceptance, but as the absence of resistance, a gradual settling into what continues without needing to be questioned. You begin to understand that the system no longer feels external. It feels present, integrated into how things move, how things happen, how things continue. There is a moment, brief and almost unnoticeable, when you realize that nothing within the day feels out of place, yet nothing stands apart as something that must be examined or reconsidered. Everything fits. Everything follows. Everything continues. And in that moment, there is no strong reaction, no sense of recognition that demands attention, only a quiet awareness that this is how things are. Around you, the same pattern holds across others. Movement aligning, behavior settling into forms that repeat without variation. The difference between individuals becomes less visible in action, not because it disappears, but because it is expressed within the same limits. The system no longer needs to correct as often, because there is less to correct. As more days pass, and then many more, the sense of what once felt different becomes harder to recall, not erased, but distant, a no longer connected to the present rhythm. You may remember that things once required more attention, more adjustment, more awareness, but those memories do not shape what you do now. They remain, but they do not guide. Within this structure, time itself begins to feel smoother, not marked by sharp changes, but by the continuation of the same pattern across each day. There are fewer moments that stand out, fewer points that separate one experience from another. Only flow, only repetition, only continuation. You move within it without needing to step outside, without needing to compare, without needing to question whether it could be different, because nothing within it asks you to do so. And over time, this absence of questioning becomes part of the pattern itself, reinforcing the structure without needing to be enforced. There is no clear point where this becomes complete, no moment where you can say that everything has settled, only a gradual shift where what continues becomes what is expected, and what is expected becomes what is. And as you remain within that rhythm, following the same paths, repeating the same actions, feeling the same structure holding everything together, you begin to understand that this is not simply a system that exists around you. It is one that exists through you, carried forward, without resistance, without interruption, in the same way. Every day, it does not feel like you have changed. There is no clear moment where you can say that you are different from before. no point where something inside you shifts in a way that demands attention. You continue as you always have, moving through the same rhythm, following the same patterns, responding in the same ways that have become familiar over time. The day unfolds. The motion continues. Nothing stands out. And because nothing stands out, there is no reason to question it. You begin to notice small things, not as changes, but as absences. Moments where something that once felt present no longer appears in the same way. A hesitation that does not come. A thought that does not fully form. A choice that resolves itself before you are aware of making it. These are not disruptions. They are adjustments. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, patterns have repeated long enough that they no longer feel external. No longer something you follow, but something that happens through you. The structure does not replace what you are. It aligns it, reducing variation, narrowing difference, until what remains moves within a consistent form. You continue your work, lifting, placing, repeating, the same sequence carried forward without interruption. And there's no moment where you pause to consider doing it differently. Not because you cannot, but because it does not occur to you. The body moves with a steadiness that no longer feels imposed, each action following the last without resistance, without the need to adjust. There is less tension and anticipation, fewer moments where you prepare for uncertainty, because uncertainty has been reduced to something that rarely appears. Over time, the distinction between what you feel and what you do becomes less visible, not because feeling disappears, but because action no longer depends on it in the same way. You respond, because responding is what happens, not because you have chosen how to respond. Around you, others move in the same pattern, not identical, but aligned, their actions following the same structure, their responses fitting within the same limits. The difference between individuals becomes harder to see in motion, not because it is gone, but because it does not change what happens. Within this environment, identity does not disappear. It becomes less necessary, less present in the actions that define each day. You may remember that things once felt more open, that decisions once carried more weight, or that responses once depended on something internal. But those memories feel distant, not unclear, but disconnected from the pattern you now follow. They do not guide you, they do not interrupt, they remain, but they do not return. The sound of daily life continues in the same way, steady, predictable, aligned across space, reinforcing the sense that everything moves within a shared structure. You do not need to match others exactly, and yet you do, not by intention, but by repetition. Over many days and then many more, this alignment becomes easier, not because it is enforced, but because it is familiar, because it requires less effort than deviation. You begin to feel that your actions are not separate from the system. They are part of it, carrying it forward, without needing to be directed. There is a moment, brief and quiet, when you look at what surrounds you and recognize that nothing within it requires you to be different. Nothing asks for variation. Nothing depends on distinction. And in that moment, there is no resistance, no sense of loss that rises strongly enough to interrupt what continues. Only recognition that this is enough. Within this structure, the self does not vanish. It settles into patterns that repeat, into movements that align, into responses that do not change. You continue through the same sequence, the same rhythm, the same pattern that carries everything forward, and the difference between who you are and what you do becomes quieter, not gone, but less visible. As more time passes, the need to define yourself separately from what surrounds you becomes less present. Not because it is taken away, but because it is no longer required for the system to continue. You exist within it, and it exists through you. The boundary between the two becomes difficult to locate, not because it disappears completely, but because it no longer matters in the same way. There is no moment where this becomes complete, no clear point where you can say that something has ended. Only continuation, only alignment, only the steady presence of a pattern that does not break. And as you remain within that movement, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, feeling the same structure shaping what you do, you begin to understand that you are no longer moving through the system. You are moving as part of it, and it continue in the same way without needing to ask who you were before. They do not notice anything missing. For them, there is no sense that something has been reduced, no feeling that the world could have taken a different shape, because they have never known it in any other way. You see them moving through the same spaces, following the same patterns, but without the quiet comparison that still lingers somewhere within you. Their steps are steady, not because they have learned to adjust, but because there is nothing for them to adjust to. The path is already clear, the structure already holds, and so they move within it, as though it has always been this way. Within the unified world shaped under Qin Shi Huang, a generation begins to grow that does not remember division, that does not carry the memory of shifting borders or uncertain authority. For them, consistency is not something that arrived. It is something that exists. They learn through repetition, through patterns that do not change, through expectations that remain the same from one day to the next. There is no need to explain why things are structured this way, because there is no alternative to compare it to. You notice the difference in small moments, in how they respond without hesitation, and in how their actions follow the pattern without the quiet awareness that once accompanied yours. They do not pause in the same way. They do not look for variation. They continue, because continuation is all they have known. The environment reinforces this without needing to speak. Roads that connect without interruption, systems that apply without exception, spaces that do not shift depending on where you stand. To them, this is not order imposed. It is simply how things are. They move through their work with the same rhythm, the same repetition, but without the sense that it could be otherwise. Without the memory of adjustment that still exists somewhere beneath your own actions. Their bodies do not carry the same hesitation. Their movements do not contain the same awareness of limitation, because limitation is not something that arrived. It is something that has always been present. Over time, this difference becomes more visible, not through contrast in action, but through contrast in perception. How the same structure feels different, depending on whether it was introduced or always existed. You may feel the weight of the pattern. They feel its stability. You may sense its limits. They move within its clarity. This does not create conflict. It creates distance, a quiet separation between those who remember and those who do not. Within this new generation, identity forms differently, not shaped by adjustment, and not defined by contrast, but by alignment from the beginning. They do not need to fit into the system. They begin within it. And so their sense of self does not extend beyond it in the same way. The difference is not visible in what they do, but in how they understand what they are doing. For them, the pattern does not restrict, it defines. The sound of daily life continues as before, steady, consistent, aligned across space, but within it, there's a subtle shift in tone. Something quieter, something more settled. You hear it in how they speak, in what they do not question, in what they do not need to ask. Over many days, and then many more, this generation continues to grow, carrying the same patterns forward, reinforcing them not through effort, but through familiarity. They do not resist, because there is nothing to resist against. They do not adapt, because there is nothing to adapt from. They continue, because continuation is what exists. You begin to understand that the system no longer depends on those who remember what came before. It holds through those who do not, through those who carry it without comparison, without hesitation, without the need to question its form. There is a moment, quiet and difficult to hold, when you realize that what once felt imposed now feels natural to them, not because it has changed, but because they have never known anything else. And in that realization there is no clear sense of loss, only distance, a separation between what was experienced and what is simply lived. Within this structure, yet the past does not disappear. It becomes less relevant, not erased, but no longer shaping what continues. You remain within the same pattern, following the same rhythm, carrying the same actions forward, but with an awareness that is no longer shared in the same way. They move beside you, but not from the same place. And over time, even that difference begins to soften, not because it is resolved, but because it is not expressed in what continues. The pattern holds across both, across those who remember and those who do not. And as it holds, the distinction between them becomes quieter, less visible, less necessary, until what remains is not the difference between past and present, but the continuation of what exists now, carried forward, without needing to recall what came before, without needing to imagine what could be different. Only what is, only what continues. In the same way, across everyone who lives within it, nothing seems out of place anymore. There are no visible breaks in the pattern, no moments where the structure falters or reveals itself as something separate from the world it holds together. Everything moves as it should. Everything continues, without interruption. You walk through spaces that feel complete, not because they have stopped changing, but because every change fits within what is already expected. There are no sudden shifts, no need to adjust in the way that once defined how people lived, only a steady continuation that carries from one moment to the next. The system does not need to assert itself. It is already present in everything that happens. Within the world shaped under Qin Shi Huang, control has reached a point where it no longer appears as control, but as order, something that feels natural because it does not break. You begin to notice how little resistance exists, not because it has been removed entirely, but because it no longer reaches the surface in a way that interrupts what continues. Actions follow patterns that do not change. Responses align without effort. And even the smallest movements seem to fit into a structure that does not need to be reinforced. there is no need for correction, because there is little to correct. The environment reflects this with a quiet precision. Roads that lead without confusion, systems that apply without exception, spaces that function without requiring explanation. Everything feels aligned, not forced, but held. You move through your day without encountering moments that demand attention, without needing to reconsider how things are done, without stepping outside the rhythm that carries everything forward. It does not feel restrictive, it feels complete. Within this structure, perfection does not mean flawlessness, but consistency. The ability for the system to continue without breaking, without requiring adjustment, without depending on any single element to hold it together. You begin to understand that nothing within it exists separately, that each part supports the next, creating a continuity that does not leave space for disruption. The body moves with ease, not because the effort has lessened, but because it has aligned fully with the pattern, no longer pushing against it, no longer resisting its shape. There is no hesitation, no deviation, only continuation. Over time, this state becomes invisible, not because it is hidden, but because it is everywhere, leaving no contrast through which it can be recognized as something distinct. You do not notice the system, because there is nothing outside of it to compare it to. Around you, others move in the same way, their actions flowing without interruption, and their responses fitting within the same structure, their presence reinforcing the pattern without needing to be directed. There is no visible tension between individual and system, because the two no longer oppose each other. They align. The sound of daily life carries this sense of completion, steady, uninterrupted, without sudden change or irregularity, a continuous flow that does not break into separate parts. Even silence fits within this pattern, not as absence, but as another form of continuity, something that does not disrupt what holds everything together. You begin to feel that nothing within the day requires your attention in a way that stands apart. Nothing calls you to step outside the pattern to examine it. Everything simply continues, as it always has, as it always will. Within this environment, control no longer needs to be visible to be effective, because it has reached a point where visibility is no longer necessary. You do not feel watched, you do not feel directed, and yet you do not move outside what is expected. There is a moment, quiet and almost impossible to define, when you realize that nothing within the system needs to change in order for it to continue. Not because it has reached an end point, but because it has reached stability, a form of balance that does not shift, that does not require correction, that does not depend on awareness to remain intact. This realization does not create resistance. It does not interrupt the flow. It settles, becoming part of how the world is understood. You continue through the same actions, the same rhythm, the same pattern that holds everything together, and there is no need to step outside of it, because there is nowhere else to stand. Within this state, perfection is not experienced as achievement. It is experienced as absence, the absence of disruption, the absence of uncertainty, the absence of anything that would require change. Everything holds, everything continues, everything remains, and because it remains, it does not draw attention to itself, it does not ask to be noticed, it simply exists in the same way, across everything, across everyone, without interruption, without resistance, without end. At first, nothing appears to be wrong. The pattern still holds, the rhythm continues, and everything moves in the same way it always has. Steady, consistent, uninterrupted. You follow the same path, repeat the same actions, and there is no moment that clearly signals a change. But something begins to feel different, not in what you see, but in how it holds. A delay that is almost too small to notice, a response that arrives just slightly out of place, a movement that does not align as smoothly as before. These are not disruptions. They pass quickly, and the pattern continues. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, consistency remains strong, but the precision that once defined it begins to soften at the edges, not enough to break, but enough to be felt. You begin to notice that some actions require a second attempt, that certain outcomes are no longer as immediate or as certain as they once were. The difference is small, almost invisible, but it repeats. And because it repeats, it becomes harder to ignore. Around you, others continue in the same way, their movements steady, their actions aligned. But there are moments now where the rhythm does not carry perfectly from one to the next. A pause that lingers, a step that falls slightly out of place, and then correction, return, continuation. The environment reflects this in subtle ways, not through visible damage, but through slight inconsistencies, areas where the system does not feel as seamless as it once did. Nothing breaks, but not everything flows. You move through your day as before, but there is a quiet awareness that begins to form, something that does not interrupt your actions but exists alongside them. That the pattern is no longer perfect, that it requires effort to remain as it is. The body feels this before the mind fully understands it, a small tension in movement, a brief hesitation where none existed before, a sense that continuation is no longer entirely effortless. It does not stop you, it does not slow the system, but it remains. Over time, these moments begin to appear more often, not enough to disrupt the whole, but enough to create a subtle shift in how it is experienced. You begin to notice that correction is happening more frequently, that alignment is maintained, but no longer automatic in the same way. Within this structure, stability still exists, but it is no longer invisible. It becomes something that must be sustained, something that does not hold entirely on its own. You may not speak of it, but you feel it, in the way actions are carried out with slightly more care, in the way responses arrive with a trace of delay. Around you, the same process unfolds. Others adjusting in small ways, maintaining the pattern not by default, but by effort. The difference is not dramatic, but it is present. And because it is present, it changes how the system feels. The sound of daily life continues, but there are small variations now, brief interruptions, slight inconsistencies that do not stop the rhythm, but alter it just enough to be noticed. It is not disorder, it is not collapse, it is deviation, contained, corrected, but not absent. Within this environment, the idea of perfection begins to shift, no longer defined by complete consistency, but by the ability to recover, to maintain alignment even when it is briefly lost. You begin to understand that the system is no longer holding without effort. It is being held, carried forward through continuation that now requires adjustment. There is a moment, quiet and difficult to define, when you realize that what once felt natural now feels maintained, not forced, but sustained in a way that requires something from those within it. This realization does not disrupt your movement. You continue, because the pattern continues, but it changes how that movement is experienced. It is no longer invisible, it is felt. As more time passes, the repetition continues, the system holds, but the subtle inconsistencies do not disappear, they remain, appearing again and again in ways that are small, but consistent. You begin to expect them, not as failure, but as part of how things now function. Within this shift, the system does not break, it adapts, maintaining its structure while absorbing these small deviations into its pattern. But the difference remains between what was once effortless and what is now sustained. You move within it, carrying the same actions forward, following the same rhythm, but with an awareness that is slightly sharper, slightly more present than before. The pattern continues, but it is no longer seamless. And as this continues across many days and many more, and the first cracks do not widen immediately, they remain small, contained, but persistent. And because they persist, they begin to define how the system is experienced, not as something that cannot change, but as something that is beginning to. It begins to happen more often. Not in a way that forces attention, not in a way that stops the pattern, but in small repetitions that return before they have fully faded. You move through the same rhythm as before, but the moments that once felt rare now appear again and then again, each one carrying a slight difference that does not disappear entirely, a delay that lingers longer than it should, a response that does not arrive as cleanly as before, in a movement that requires correction more than once. These are still small, still contained, but no longer isolated. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, continuity is still maintained, but it no longer flows without interruption. It is held together through repeated adjustment. You begin to notice how often alignment needs to be restored, how frequently the pattern requires correction in order to continue in the same form. The difference is not visible at a distance, but it is felt up close. The body carries this change in a quiet way, a slight increase in effort, a need to remain more aware, a sense that continuation now depends on attention rather than familiarity alone. You move more carefully, not by choice, but because the pattern no longer carries itself as easily as it once did. Around you, others respond in the same way, not stopping, not breaking the rhythm, but adjusting more often, aligning their actions with a structure that no longer holds automatically. The environment begins to reflect this shift more clearly, not through collapse, but through inconsistency, areas where the system does not feel as stable as before. Nothing has fallen apart, but not everything holds. Over time, these inconsistencies begin to connect, not as a single failure, but as a pattern of small deviations that appear across different places, different moments, different parts of the system. You begin to sense that what you are experiencing is not isolated, it is shared. The sound of daily life changes in a subtle way, still steady, still continuous, but with small interruptions that repeat often enough to alter the rhythm. It does not stop, but it no longer flows without resistance. Within this state, the system continues to function, but it requires more from those within it. More attention, more correction, more effort to maintain the same form. You feel this in how actions are carried out, in the slight tension that accompanies movement. in the awareness that continuation is no longer effortless. There is no instruction that explains this, no moment that defines it, only repetition, only experience, only the quiet understanding that something is changing beneath what remains visible. As more days pass, and then many more, the need for correction becomes part of the pattern itself, no longer an exception, but a regular element of how the system continues. You begin to expect it, not as disruption, but as part of what now exists. This expectation changes how you move, how you respond, how you carry out the same actions that once required no adjustment at all. You remain within the rhythm, but the rhythm no longer carries you completely. You carry it. Around you, the same shift unfolds, others maintaining the pattern through effort rather than familiarity, their movements aligning, not because they happen naturally, but because they are guided back into place. The difference between these two states is not dramatic, but it is constant. And because it is constant, it defines the experience of the system more than its structure does. Within this environment, stability is no longer invisible. It becomes something that is actively sustained, something that requires continuation to remain intact. You begin to understand that what once held itself together now depends on those within it to keep it from breaking. This realization does not stop the system. It deepens your awareness of it. The body feels the strain more clearly now, not as exhaustion alone, but as effort that extends beyond the physical, into the act of maintaining alignment, of correcting movement, of ensuring that continuation does not falter. It is not overwhelming, but it is persistent. There is a moment, quiet and difficult to hold, when you realize that the system is no longer unchanging, that it is being sustained, that it could shift further. This thought does not remain long. It passes because the work continue, because the pattern continue, because stopping to consider it does not change what follows. As the days continue, the small cracks do not disappear. They spread, not dramatically, not in a way that breaks the whole, but in a way that ensures they are always present, somewhere within it. You move through spaces where things still hold, and others where they require adjustment, where the difference is not in structure, but in how much effort is needed to maintain it. The system remains, but it is no longer seamless. And as this continues, across time, across space, across every part of what once felt perfectly aligned, the experience of it changes, not into disorder, not into collapse, but into something that must be held together, constantly, quietly, without pause. And as you remain within that movement, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, feeling the same structure beneath everything that continues, you begin to understand that the system has not broken, but it is no longer whole, and what holds it now is not only its design, but the effort of those within it. There are moments now where the pattern does not return immediately, not broken, not lost, but delayed, held just slightly out of place before it settles back into alignment. You continue as before, moving through the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, but those brief delays no longer disappear as quickly as they once did. They remain, just long enough to be felt. A response that arrives too late to feel natural. A correction that requires more than one attempt. A sequence that does not fully connect from one step to the next. These are still small, but they do not resolve as cleanly. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, continuity is maintained, but the control that once guided it without effort begins to show signs of strain, not through collapse, but through hesitation. You begin to notice that some actions no longer lead directly to their expected outcome, that the connection between cause and result feels less immediate, less certain. It is not confusion, but it is no longer clarity. The body reacts first. A slight pause before movement, a moment where the next step is not as automatic as before, a sense that something must be adjusted before continuation is possible. You move anyway, because the pattern still exists, but it no longer carries you completely. Around you, others experience the same shift, their movements still aligned, but with small interruptions that do not disappear, small gaps that must be filled before the rhythm continues. The environment reflects this more clearly now, not just in isolated moments, but in the way certain processes take longer, require more attention, or do not resolve as smoothly as they once did. Nothing has failed, but not everything connects. Over time, these gaps begin to overlap, not in a way that creates immediate disorder, but in a way that increases the effort required to maintain continuity across the system. You begin to feel that continuation is no longer guaranteed, it must be ensured. The sound of daily life carries this shift, still steady, still present, but with interruptions that linger longer, corrections that take more time, and sequences that do not flow as seamlessly. It does not stop, but it hesitates. Within this state, control is still present, but it no longer operates invisibly. It becomes something that must be reasserted, not through force alone, but through repeated effort to restore alignment. You feel this in how actions are carried out, in the need to confirm, to adjust, to ensure that what follows matches what is expected. There is no clear instruction that marks this change, only the experience of it, only the repetition of moments where control must be reestablished. The body carries a different kind of tension now, not the steady strain of effort, but the uncertainty of whether the next action will align as it should. It is not overwhelming, but it is persistent. There is a moment, brief and difficult to define, when you realize that the system is no longer fully directing what happens. It is responding, adjusting, correcting. This realization does not stop the pattern, but it changes how you move within it. You become more aware, not by choice, but because awareness is now required to maintain what once held on its own. Around you, the same process unfolds, the others carrying the pattern forward, but with visible effort, their actions aligning not because they naturally follow, but because they are guided back into place. The difference is subtle, but it is everywhere. Within this environment, the idea of control shifts, no longer defined by the absence of deviation, but by the ability to contain it, to prevent it from expanding beyond what can be corrected. You begin to understand that the system is no longer preventing change. It is managing it. This creates a different kind of stability, one that holds through constant adjustment rather than perfect alignment. You continue through your work, repeating the same actions, following the same rhythm, but with a sense that continuation now depends on more than structure alone. It depends on effort, on attention, on the ability to respond when alignment falters. As more days pass, the pattern remains, but the experience of it continues to shift. not toward collapse, but toward something less certain, less fixed, less complete. You begin to expect interruption, not as failure, but as part of how things now function. The system still holds, but it no longer feels unbreakable. And as this continues, across time, across space, across every part of what once felt fully controlled, the sense of stability changes, not disappearing, but thinning, becoming something that must be maintained rather than something that simply exists. And as you remain within that movement, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, feeling the same structure beneath everything that continues, you begin to understand. That control has not been lost, but it is no longer complete, and what remains is something that continues, not because it cannot change, but because it is being held against that change. At some point, the pattern no longer returns in the same way. It does not break, not completely, but when it shifts, it does not settle back into its previous form as easily as before. You continue through the same sequence, the same rhythm, the same actions that have carried you this far, but there is a difference now in how they connect. A step that leads somewhere slightly different, a response that does not match what came before, a correction that restores movement, but not in the exact shape it once held. These changes are small, but they remain. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, continuity still exists, but it no longer follows a single, stable path. Instead, it begins to shift, adjusting not back to what was, but into something slightly altered each time. You begin to notice that repetition no longer produces the same result, that even when actions appear identical, the outcome carries subtle differences that do not fully align with what you expect. It is not disorder, but it is no longer consistency. The body feels this in the way movement requires more awareness, more adjustment, more attention to what is happening in the moment rather than relying on what has always been. You move carefully, not because you are told to, but because the pattern no longer holds you in the same way. Around you, others respond in similar ways, their actions still aligned, but with variations that are no longer corrected completely. Small differences that accumulate rather than disappear. The environment reflects this shift more clearly now, not in collapse, but in divergence, places where the system continues, but not in exactly the same form across every space. Nothing stops, but not everything matches. Over time, these variations begin to spread, not dramatically, not in a way that forces immediate change, but in a quiet expansion that alters the system from within. You begin to sense that what once moved as a single pattern is now becoming multiple, each one slightly different, each one continuing in its own way. The sound of daily life carries this change, still steady, still present, but no longer uniform. Variations appearing in rhythm, in timing, in how actions follow one another. It does not fall apart, but it no longer flows as one. Within this state, control does not disappear, but it loses its precision, no longer able to restore every deviation to the same exact form. You begin to understand that correction still happens, but it no longer returns things to what they were. It creates something new, something close, but not identical. This creates a different kind of continuation, one that does not depend on exact repetition, but on the ability to keep moving forward even as the pattern shifts. You continue your work, repeating the same actions, following the same structure, but now within a system that is no longer perfectly aligned with itself. The difference is subtle, but it is constant. The body adapts in response, adjusting not only to effort, but to variation, learning to move within a pattern that changes slightly each time it is repeated. This adaptation does not stop the system. It allows it to continue, but it changes how continuation feels. There is a moment, quiet and difficult to define, when you realize that the system is no longer returning to itself, it is moving forward, away from what it once was. This realization does not interrupt your actions. You continue because the pattern continues, but it alters your awareness of what that pattern is. Around you, others experience the same shift. Their movements aligned enough to sustain the system, but no longer identical enough to maintain perfect consistency. The difference between these two states becomes more visible over time, not as a break, but as a drift, a slow movement away from a fixed form. Within this environment, stability changes meaning, no longer defined by sameness, but by the ability to continue despite difference. You begin to expect variation, not as error, but as part of what now exists. As more days pass, the system holds, but not in the same way, not as a single, unified structure, but as something that continues across many small differences, each one carried forward without being fully resolved. You move through it, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, but within a space that feels less fixed, less certain, less complete. The pattern still exists, but it is no longer one. And as this continues across time, across space, across everything that once felt fully aligned, the sense of unity begins to soften, not disappearing but losing its sharpness. The system does not collapse. It shifts. And in that shift, something changes, not suddenly, not visibly, but continuously, without returning. And as you remain within that movement, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, feeling the same structure beneath everything that continues, you begin to understand that what surrounds you is no longer holding together in the same way. It is continuing, but it is no longer the same, and it will not return. There is no clear sense of where things are going anymore. The pattern continues, the rhythm remains, but the direction that once carried everything forward begins to fade, not disappearing all at once, but becoming harder to feel with each passing day. You move as you always have, following the same sequence, repeating the same actions, but the sense that those actions lead somewhere begins to loosen. A task completed does not feel like progress. A correction does not restore what was lost, and continuation no longer guarantees alignment. These changes are not immediate. They settle, gradually. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, structure still exists, but its ability to guide movement in a single direction begins to weaken, not because it has stopped functioning, but because it no longer holds everything together in the same way. You begin to notice that different parts of the system no longer feel fully connected, that actions taken in one place do not always align with what happens in another. It is not disorder, but it is no longer unity. The body senses this in subtle ways, a hesitation that does not come from uncertainty of action, but from uncertainty of outcome, a feeling that what you do continues, but does not necessarily lead where it once did. You continue anyway, because the pattern continues. But the meaning of that continuation begins to change. Around you, others move within the same structure, but with slight differences in timing, in response, and how actions unfold. Each one still aligned enough to sustain the system, but no longer aligned enough to create a single, shared direction. The environment reflects this more clearly now, not through visible collapse, but through divergence, paths that no longer lead to the same place, processes that continue, but do not resolve in the same way across different areas. Nothing stops, but nothing fully connects. Over time, this disconnection begins to accumulate, not in a way that breaks the system, but in a way that weakens its coherence, making it harder for everything to move as one. You begin to feel that the system is no longer guiding you. You are moving within it, without knowing where it leads. The sound of daily life carries this shift, still steady, still present, but lacking the clarity that once defined it, rhythms overlapping without fully aligning, actions repeating without producing the same sense of progression. It continues, but it does not build. Within this state, control becomes less about direction and more about continuation, ensuring that the system does not stop, even if it no longer moves toward a clear outcome. You begin to understand that what once felt like purpose has become process, something that continues because it continues, not because it leads somewhere defined. This realization does not stop your movement. You repeat the same actions, follow the same rhythm, carry the same effort forward, but something within that movement feels different, less certain, less connected. The body carries this difference in a quiet way, a subtle disorientation that does not interrupt action, but alters how that action is experienced. A sense that effort remains, but direction does not. It is not confusion, it is absence, the absence of a clear path. Around you, others continue as before, but with the same underlying shift. Their actions sustained, their movements aligned enough to hold the structure, but no longer guided by a shared sense of where things are going. The difference is not visible in what is done, but in what it leads to. Within this environment, the system no longer feels like something that moves forward. It feels like something that continues in place, maintaining itself, without extending, without resolving. As more days pass, the repetition continues, but the sense of accumulation fades, not disappearing entirely, but becoming less defined, less certain, less present in how the system is experienced. You begin to expect that things will continue, but not that they will change, not that they will improve, only that they will remain in motion without direction. There is a moment, quiet and difficult to hold, when you realize that the system no longer controls where it is going. It controls that it continues, and that is all. This realization does not break the pattern. It settles within it, becoming part of how you move, how you act, how you understand what surrounds you. You continue through the same sequence, the same rhythm, the same pattern that has carried everything forward, but now within a structure that no longer leads anywhere clearly defined. The movement remains, but the meaning shifts. And as this continues across time, across space, across every part of what once felt unified, the system does not collapse. It drifts, losing direction, without stopping, without breaking, without returning. And as you remain within that movement, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, feeling the same structure beneath everything that continues, you begin to understand. that what surrounds you is no longer moving towards something. It is simply continuing, and it does not know where it will end. Nothing stops all at once. There is no sudden break, no single moment where everything falls apart, only a quiet shift in how things continue. A change that does not interrupt the pattern, but alters what it produces. You move through the same rhythm as before, repeating the same actions, following the same structure that has carried everything this far. But what follows those actions begins to feel different, less certain, less complete. A task that once led to a clear result now lingers, unresolved. A sequence that once closed neatly now remains slightly open, unfinished in a way that does not fully correct itself. These changes are small, but they do not disappear. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, continuation remains, but its ability to sustain outcomes begins to weaken, not because the structure is gone, but because it no longer holds everything together as it once did. You begin to notice that effort does not always lead to completion, that movement continues but does not always resolve into something stable. It is not failure, but it is no longer reliability. The body feels this as a subtle fatigue that is different from physical exhaustion, a sense that what you do requires the same effort, but produces less certainty, less clarity, less return. You continue anyway, because the pattern continues. But something within that continuation feels thinner. Around you, others move in the same way, repeating the same actions, maintaining the same rhythm, but with results that no longer align as consistently as before. The difference is not visible in what is done, but in what remains after. The environment begins to reflect this more clearly, not through collapse, but through incompleteness. Structures that continue, but do not fully hold. Processes that unfold, but do not fully resolve. Nothing is gone, but not everything remains intact. Over time, these incomplete outcomes begin to accumulate, not dramatically, not in a way that forces immediate change, but in a way that slowly alters the system from within. You begin to feel that what you are part of is no longer building towards something. It is maintaining itself with less and less stability. The sound of daily life carries this shift. I'm still steady, still present, but with a hollow quality, as though the rhythm continues without producing the same weight it once did. It moves, but it does not hold. Within this state, collapse does not appear as destruction, but as reduction. A gradual loss of completeness, a thinning of outcomes that does not stop the system, but weakens it. You begin to understand that the system is not failing in a visible way. It is fading in function. This realization does not stop your movement. You continue through the same sequence, the same rhythm, the same pattern that has defined everything so far. But now, within a structure that no longer guarantees what it produces, the body carries this change in a quiet way, a subtle disconnect between effort and result, a feeling that what you do no longer fully translates into what remains. It is not enough to stop you, but it is enough to be felt. Around you, the same process unfolds, others continuing as before, but with outcomes that no longer align fully, each action contributing to something that holds less completely than it once did. The difference grows slowly, but it does not reverse. Within this environment, stability becomes more fragile, not visibly breaking, but requiring more effort to maintain even a partial form. You begin to expect that things will not fully resolve, that completion is no longer certain, only continuation. As more days pass, the system continues, but with increasing gaps, increasing incompleteness, increasing moments where what should hold does not fully hold. You move within it, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, but with a growing awareness that the system is no longer sustaining itself in the same way. It continues, but it does not restore. There is a moment, quiet and difficult to define, when you realize that what surrounds you is no longer stable, not in the way it once was, not in the way it once held everything together without effort. This realization does not create panic. It does not interrupt the pattern. It settles, becoming part of how you experience what continues. You keep moving, because the system keeps moving, but the sense that it will hold begins to fade. And as this continues across time, across space, across everything that once felt unified and complete, the system does not collapse into nothing. It diminishes, gradually, quietly, without stopping, without breaking completely, without returning to what it was. And as you remain within that movement, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, feeling the same structure beneath everything that continues, you begin to understand. That collapse is not an event, it is a process, one that has already begun and will continue in the same way, until there is nothing left for it to hold. It becomes easier to see now, not because anything has broken completely, but because the small gaps that once remained hidden no longer stay contained. They begin to show themselves in ways that cannot be fully absorbed by the pattern. You move through the same rhythm as before, following the same sequence, repeating the same actions, but the results no longer settle into place as they once did. A task remains unfinished longer than expected. A structure holds but feels uncertain. A process continues but does not fully resolve. These are no longer isolated. They remain visible. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, continuity still exists, but it no longer conceals its own instability. The effort required to maintain it becomes more apparent in how things unfold. You begin to notice that alignment is not only adjusted, it is struggled for. The body responds to this shift more clearly now, a deeper fatigue, not only from repetition, but from the effort of maintaining something that does not fully hold. You continue to move, but the movement feels heavier. Not because the work has changed, but because the system no longer carries it in the same way. Around you, others reflect this change, their actions still aligned enough to continue, but with visible strain, corrections that take longer, responses that do not fully settle even after they are made. The difference is no longer subtle. It is present. The environment begins to show this instability more openly, not through collapse, but through inconsistency that remains, structures that stand but do not feel secure, processes that continue but do not fully connect. Nothing has fallen apart, but nothing fully holds. Over time, these visible inconsistencies begin to shape how the system is experienced. No longer as something that quietly continues, but as something that must be actively sustained at every level. You begin to feel that continuation itself requires effort, not just in what you do, but in how the system supports what you do. The sound of daily life carries this change, still steady, still present, but with strain beneath it. a tension that does not break the rhythm but weighs on it. It continues, but it resists. Within this state, control does not disappear, but it becomes uneven, holding in some places, weakening in others, no longer applying with the same consistency across the entire system. You begin to understand that what once felt unified is now fragmented beneath the surface, even if it still appears connected from a distance. This realization does not interrupt your actions. You continue, because the pattern continues, but your awareness of it deepens. The body carries this awareness in a quiet way, a sense that effort is no longer supported evenly, that some actions require more to sustain than others, that continuation is no longer balanced. It is not chaos, but it is no longer stable. Around you, the same unevenness appears, others continuing within the pattern, but with different levels of strain, different levels of alignment, different levels of completion. The difference between these becomes more visible over time, not through dramatic change, but through repetition of imbalance. Within this environment, the idea of order shifts again, no longer defined by consistency, but by the ability to prevent collapse, to hold the system together even as it begins to separate internally. You begin to feel that what surrounds you is no longer a single structure. It is many parts, trying to remain one. As more days pass, the pattern continues, but with increasing resistance, increasing strain, increasing visibility of what does not fully align. You move through it, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, but within a system that no longer supports itself in the same way. It continues, but it struggles. There is a moment, quiet and difficult to hold, and when you realize that the system is no longer capable of fully containing what is happening within it, that what once remained hidden now surfaces, that what once resolved now lingers. This realization does not stop the pattern. It changes how you experience it. You continue your work, not because everything holds, but because stopping is not part of what remains possible. Around you, others do the same, sustaining the system not through stability, but through continuation despite instability. The difference between these two states becomes clear. One held everything together, the other keeps it from falling apart. Within this shift, collapse is no longer distant. It is present, not complete, but visible. As time continues, the system remains in motion, but with increasing gaps, increasing strain, increasing moments where what should hold does not fully do so. You move within it, carrying the same actions forward, following the same rhythm, but with a growing awareness that continuation alone is no longer enough to maintain what once existed. It holds, but not completely. It continues, but not smoothly. And as this persists, across time, across space, across everything that once felt stable and unified, the system does not suddenly collapse. It reveals itself as something that is no longer whole, something that continues, but cannot fully sustain what it once was. And as you remain within that movement, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, feeling the same structure beneath everything that continues, you begin to understand that what surrounds you is no longer holding together in silence. It is holding together in strain, and that strain is becoming everything. It no longer feels like everything can be held together. The pattern continues, the rhythm remains, but the sense that it can sustain itself completely begins to fade, not suddenly, not in a way that stops movement, but in a way that is present in every action that follows. You move through the same sequence, repeating the same tasks, following the same structure that once carried everything forward without interruption. But now, and each action feels as though it must stand on its own, no longer fully supported by what surrounds it. A task completes, but does not connect. A response arrives, but does not resolve. A structure stands, but does not feel secure. These are no longer exceptions. They are constant. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, continuity still exists, but its ability to bind everything into a single, stable form has weakened to the point where it can no longer fully contain what is happening within it. You begin to notice that alignment is no longer restored completely, that even after correction, something remains slightly out of place, slightly disconnected, slightly unresolved. The difference does not disappear. It stays. The body responds to this in a deeper way now, not only through effort, but through a sense of instability that does not fade between actions, a feeling that what you are part of is no longer held in the same way. You continue to move, because movement continues. But the ground beneath that movement feels less certain. Around you, others reflect this change, their actions still following the pattern, but with visible gaps that do not close, inconsistencies that do not resolve, efforts that do not fully restore what was lost. The difference is no longer subtle. It defines the experience. The environment begins to show this instability openly, not through collapse, but through fragmentation, structures that exist without full connection, processes that continue without full coherence. Nothing has disappeared, but nothing fully holds together. Over time, this fragmentation spreads, not as a single break, but as many small separations that no longer merge back into one. You begin to feel that what surrounds you is no longer a unified system, but a collection of parts, continuing side by side, without fully aligning. The sound of daily life carries this shift, still present, still continuous but uneven. Rhythms that overlap without matching. Actions that repeat without forming a single flow. It continues, but it does not unify. Within this state, control no longer functions as a force that brings everything together. It becomes something that attempts to manage separation, to prevent fragmentation from becoming collapse. You begin to understand that the system is no longer maintaining itself. It is preventing itself from falling apart. This realization does not stop your actions. You continue through the same rhythm, the same sequence, the same pattern that has carried everything this far, but with an awareness that is now impossible to ignore. That continuation alone is no longer enough. The body carries this awareness in a constant tension, not sharp, not overwhelming, but present in every movement, in every action that does not fully connect to what follows. It is not fear, it is instability. Around you, others move within the same condition, sustaining the pattern not because it holds, but because it has not yet fallen completely. Their actions align just enough, but no longer fully. The difference between these two states becomes clear, not as a concept, but as an experience. One created structure, the other delays collapse. Within this environment, the idea of continuation shifts again, no longer defined by forward movement, but by the absence of complete failure, by the ability to keep going even when nothing fully holds. You begin to expect disconnection, not as anomaly, but as reality. As more days pass, the system continues, but with increasing separation, increasing instability, increasing moments where what once formed a whole now remains apart. You move within it, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, but within a structure that can no longer unify itself completely. It exists, but not as one. There is a moment, quiet and difficult to hold, when you realize that the system is no longer capable of restoring itself to what it was. That what is separated will remain. That what is weakened will not fully recover. This realization does not stop the pattern. It becomes part of it. You continue your work not because everything holds together, but because it has not yet fully come apart. Around you, others do the same, carrying forward a system that exists on the edge, not stable, not broken, but unable to return to either. The difference between continuation and collapse becomes thinner, less defined, more present. Within this shift, the system no longer feels like something that will endure indefinitely. It feels like something that is nearing its limit. And as this continues across time, across space, across everything that once felt unified and complete, the system does not suddenly fall. It reaches a point where holding on and falling apart begin to feel the same. It no longer holds in the same way. The pattern continues, but it cannot carry everything within it anymore. Parts begin to slip beyond what can be contained. Not all at once, not completely, but enough to change how everything feels. You move through the same rhythm, following the same sequence, repeating the same actions. But the structure beneath those actions no longer supports them as it once did. A task breaks apart before it fully resolves. A process stops before it connects. A movement continues, but does not lead where it should. These are no longer rare. They remain unresolved. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, continuity still exists, but it no longer contains the system fully. What was once held together now begins to separate in ways that are not corrected. You begin to notice that some things no longer return at all, that certain parts of the pattern, once broken, do not rejoin, do not align again, do not become part of what continues. They remain apart, and the system moves without them. The body feels this more clearly now, not only as strain or instability, but as interruption, moments where the expected flow stops, where continuation pauses, where something does not carry forward. You adjust because adjustment is still possible, but it no longer restores what was lost. Around you, others experience the same interruptions, their actions continuing, but with gaps that do not close, breaks that do not reconnect, efforts that do not fully rebuild what has separated. The difference is no longer between stability and instability. It is between what continues and what no longer does. The environment reflects this openly, not as a single collapse, but as many small failures, structures that remain incomplete, processes that stop midway, spaces where the system does not reach. Nothing disappears entirely, but parts of it no longer function. Over time, these non-functioning parts begin to accumulate, not merging back into the system, but remaining separate, creating a landscape where continuation exists alongside absence. You begin to feel that what surrounds you is no longer whole, not even in the sense of something struggling to remain whole, but as something that has already begun to separate into what holds and what does not. The sound of daily life changes in a way that is difficult to ignore. No longer a continuous rhythm, but a series of movements interrupted by silence. Actions followed by gaps, sequences that begin but do not fully complete. It continues, but it breaks. Within this state, control no longer attempts to unify everything. It attempts to preserve what remains, to maintain continuation where it is still possible, without restoring what has already fallen away. You begin to understand that the system is no longer resisting collapse. It is continuing through it. This realization settles deeply, not as a sudden awareness, but as something that becomes impossible to ignore. You continue your work, repeating the same actions, following the same rhythm, but now within a structure that no longer guarantees that those actions will connect, resolve, or hold. The body adapts again, not to stability, not to strain, but to interruption, learning to move forward even when what surrounds it does not fully support that movement. It is not smooth, but it continues. Around you, others do the same, carrying forward what remains of the pattern, even as parts of it fall away, even as connections weaken, even as outcomes fail to fully form. The difference between continuation and collapse begins to dissolve, not because they are the same, but because they are happening at the same time. Within this environment, the system no longer exists as a single structure. It exists as a process, one that continues. Even as it loses itself, you begin to expect that some things will not complete, that some actions will not connect, that some parts will remain separate. And this expectation changes how you move, not stopping you, not altering the pattern entirely, but shaping how you experience it. As more days pass, the collapse does not accelerate dramatically. It deepens, extending into more parts of the system, affecting more sequences, creating more gaps that do not close. You move within it, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, but within a structure that no longer holds together even in appearance. It exists, but in fragments. There is a moment, quiet and difficult to hold, when you realize that what surrounds you is no longer becoming unstable. It is already collapsing, not completely, not all at once, but in a way that cannot be reversed. This realization does not stop the pattern. It becomes part of it. You continue, because continuation is what remains. Around you, others do the same, sustaining what they can, moving within what still functions, existing within a system that is no longer whole. The difference between what is and what was becomes impossible to ignore. Not because it is explained, but because it is experienced. Within this shift, a collapse is no longer something that will happen. It is something that is happening now, across everything, at once. And as you remain within that movement, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, feeling the same structure beneath everything that continues, you begin to understand that what surrounds you is not ending in a single moment. It is ending in many, each one small, each one quiet, each one final. It becomes harder to recognize what is still part of the system. Not because everything has disappeared, but because the shape that once held it together no longer defines what continues and what does not. You move through the same spaces, follow the same paths, repeat the same actions, but the structure that once gave those actions meaning begins to fade. A sequence starts, but does not fully form. A process continues. but without a clear boundary. A pattern exists, but without a consistent shape. These are no longer interruptions, they are conditions. Within the system shaped under Qin Shi Huang, what remains is no longer unified by structure, but by continuation alone, a movement that persists even as the form that once guided it dissolves. You begin to notice that it is no longer possible to tell where one part ends and another begins, that boundaries between processes, between actions, between sequences, no longer hold in the same way. Everything continues, but not as something clearly defined. The body responds to this in a quiet disorientation, not stopping, not resisting, but moving without the same sense of position, without the same awareness of where you are within the pattern. You continue, because continuation is still possible, but it no longer follows a clear path. Around you, others move within the same condition. Their actions still present, still repeated, but no longer forming a consistent structure across space or time. Each movement exists, but not always in relation to the next. The environment reflects this shift more deeply now, not through collapse, but through dissolution. Structures that no longer maintain their shape, systems that no longer define their own boundaries, processes that exist without forming a complete whole. Nothing has fully vanished, but nothing fully forms. Over time, this dissolution spreads, not by removing parts of the system, but by loosening the connections between them, until what remains is no longer a single structure, but many fragments continuing side by side. You begin to feel that what surrounds you is no longer something you can move through in a defined way. It is something you exist within, without clear edges. The sound of daily life changes again, no longer a rhythm that flows, nor a pattern that breaks, but something more scattered. Movements that continue without forming a unified sequence. Actions that repeat without aligning into a single direction. It exists, but it does not cohere. Within this state, control no longer attempts to restore structure. It continues through its absence, maintaining movement without defining form, allowing the system to persist even as its shape disappears. You begin to understand that what remains is no longer a system in the way it once was. It is a continuation of actions. Without the structure that once held them together, this realization does not interrupt what you do. You continue through the same motions, repeating the same actions, following what remains of the pattern, but with a sense that those actions no longer belong to something whole. The body adapts once more, not to stability, not to instability, but to absence of form, learning to move without relying on a clear structure to guide it. It is not comfortable, but it is possible. Around you, others do the same, their movement sustained, their actions continuing, but without forming a unified system, without aligning into something that can be recognized as a whole. The difference between system and non-system begins to dissolve, not because they are the same, but because the boundary between them no longer holds. Within this environment, the idea of collapse shifts again, no longer defined by failure, but by loss of form, by the disappearance of structure even as movement continues. You begin to expect that things will not fully connect, that actions will not fully align, that what remains will not fully form. And this expectation shapes how you move, how you act, how you continue within what no longer defines itself clearly. As more time passes, the dissolution deepens. not by removing more parts, but by further weakening the connections between them, until what remains is almost entirely without structure. You move within it, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, but within a space that no longer holds together as something recognizable. It exists, but without shape. There is a moment, quiet and difficult to hold, when you realize that the system has not simply weakened, it has lost its form. Not completely gone, but no longer whole. This realization does not stop the pattern. It becomes part of it. You continue, because continuation is what remains. Around you, others do the same, sustaining movement without structure, existing within a system that no longer defines itself. The difference between what is and what once was becomes impossible to measure, not because it is unclear, but because there is no longer a form to compare it to. Within this shift, collapse is no longer something that removes the system. It is something that dissolves it, leaving behind only what continues, without shape, without boundary, without definition. And as you remain within that movement, following the same rhythm, repeating the same actions, feeling the same continuation beneath everything that persists, you begin to understand that what surrounds you is no longer something that can be described as whole. It is something that exists without form and continues, because it has not yet stopped. There is almost nothing left to hold it together. Not in the sense that everything has vanished, but in the way that what remains no longer forms anything that can be clearly understood as a system. You move through the same space, follow the same motion, repeat the same actions, but without the structure that once gave those actions direction, connection, or meaning. A movement happens, but does not belong to anything larger. A sequence begins, but does not extend. A pattern exists, but only in fragments. These are no longer changes. They are what remains. Within what was once shaped under Qin Shi Huang, continuity has not disappeared, but it has lost almost everything that once defined it. You begin to notice that actions now exist on their own, not as part of a system, not as part of a structure, but as isolated moments that do not fully connect to what comes before or after. Everything still moves, but nothing fully continues. The body responds in a quieter way than before, not with strain, not with tension, but with a kind of stillness that settles beneath the movement. You continue, but without the same sense of being carried. Around you, others move in the same way, their actions present, their movements real, but without forming something shared, something unified, something that extends beyond each individual moment. Each action exists, but only for itself. The environment reflects this emptiness, not through silence, but through absence of connection. Spaces where things happen, but do not build, do not accumulate, do not form something that lasts beyond the moment. Nothing is fully gone, but nothing fully remains. Over time, this absence becomes familiar, not because it is accepted, but because it is no longer contrasted with anything else. There is no system to compare it to, no structure to recall clearly enough to restore, only what is here, only what continues in pieces. You begin to feel that what surrounds you is no longer something that can be understood through effort, through attention, or through memory. It is something that simply exists without needing to be understood. The sound of daily life changes again, not into silence, but into something softer, less defined. Movements that occur without forming a rhythm. Actions that happen without creating a pattern. It continues, but without shape. Within this state, control no longer has meaning in the way it once did, because there is nothing left to control as a whole, only fragments that continue without forming a system. You begin to understand that what remains is not stability, not instability, but absence of structure entirely. This realization does not interrupt what you do. You continue through the same motions, repeating the same actions, following what little remains of the pattern, but with a sense that those actions no longer belong to anything beyond themselves. The body adapts one final time, not to effort, not to instability, but to emptiness, learning to move without needing structure, without needing continuity, without needing meaning to carry forward. It is not difficult, but it is quiet. Around you, others do the same, existing within the same absence, continuing not as part of a system, but as individual moments that do not fully connect. The difference between past and present becomes distant, not because it has disappeared, but because it no longer shapes what is happening now. Within this environment, what once felt immense, structured, powerful, now feels distant, almost unreal. And here is where something else begins to appear, not within the system, but within you, a quiet recognition that all of it, the structure, the control, the scale, the effort, did not disappear suddenly. It faded because it depended on something that could not last forever. And in that realization, there's no fear, no urgency, only a kind of clarity. That what feels permanent rarely is, and what feels overwhelming often passes. If you remain long enough to see it, this thought does not stay. It does not interrupt the stillness. It passes like everything else, and you continue because continuation is still what remains. But now, it feels different. Not because the world has changed again, but because something within how you see it has softened. And as you remain within that movement, following what little rhythm is left, repeating what little pattern still continues, feeling the quiet space where structure once held everything together, you begin to understand that even when everything dissolves, something remains, not the system, not the structure, but the simple act of continuing, breathing, moving, being, and perhaps that was always the only part that never depended on anything else. There is a quiet space now, not empty in the sense of nothing existing, but empty in the way that nothing presses against you, nothing demands your attention, nothing holds you within a structure that must be followed. You remain where you are, moving slowly, almost without noticing the movement itself, as though what once carried you has faded, and leaving only what continues without needing to be directed. The rhythm is still there, but it is faint, barely forming. You lift your awareness slightly, not to search for what has been lost, but to notice what remains. And what remains is not the system, not the structure, not the pattern that once defined everything. It is something quieter, something closer, something that was always there, but never needed to be seen. Within what was once shaped under Qin Shi Huang, everything moved toward scale, toward control, toward something that could extend beyond any single life. And now, that movement has faded, leaving behind only the experience of having been within it. you begin to notice that what stays with you is not the structure itself, not the system, not the vastness of what it created, but the way it felt to move through it, the weight, the rhythm, the quiet persistence of each moment. These do not disappear, they soften. They remain in a way that is no longer heavy, no longer defining, just present. The body feels different now, not strained, not controlled, not even aligned, but at rest within its own movement, no longer needing to follow a pattern, no longer needing to resist one. You continue, but now it feels like choice, even if nothing around you has changed again. Around you, the world remains as it is, fragments continuing, small motions appearing and fading, nothing forming a structure, nothing demanding continuation beyond the moment. And within this, something becomes clearer. That all of it, the order, the control, the expansion, the collapse, was never something that could remain unchanged, not because it failed, but because it was always moving, always shifting, always passing through time in the same way everything does. There is a quiet recognition here that what feels permanent while you are inside it often reveals itself as temporary once it has passed, and yet, while it exists, it feels complete. It feels real. It feels like everything. This thought does not create distance. It creates softness, a way of holding what happens without needing it to remain. The sound around you is almost gone now, not silent, but reduced to something that no longer defines space, no longer fills it. It only touches it lightly before fading. It continues, but it does not stay. You begin to understand that this is not loss in the way it once felt. It is release, not something taken away, but something that has finished being what it was. And in that, there is no urgency, no need to restore, no need to rebuild, only the quiet presence of what is here, now. The body moves again, slowly, gently, without direction, without pressure, without the need to align with anything beyond itself. And for the first time, that feels enough. There is nothing to compare it to, nothing to measure it against, nothing to return to. Only this, only now. Only the simple act of being within a moment that does not require anything more. And perhaps this is where something deeper becomes visible, not within the system, but beyond it. That meaning was never held in the structure itself, not in how large it became, not in how long it lasted, not in how completely it controlled what was within it, but in the experience of moving through it, of being present within something, even as it changed, even as it faded, even as it ended. This understanding does not stay as a thought. It becomes a feeling, quiet, steady, unnecessary to explain. You do not need to hold on to it. It does not need to remain. It passes, like everything else. And you continue. Not because something is pushing you forward, not because something is holding you in place, but because continuation itself is what remains. And as you stay within that quiet movement, following nothing, repeating nothing, simply existing within what continues without form, without pressure, without demand, you begin to understand that even when everything else fades, there is still something that does not need to be built, does not need to be controlled, does not need to last, only to be, for a moment, before it too, softly, passes. It feels quieter than before, not because everything has disappeared, but because nothing remains that needs to be held tightly, how nothing that asks you to keep it in place or prevent it from fading. You are still here, moving gently, without needing to move toward anything. The space around you does not press against you anymore. It does not shape your direction, does not carry you forward in the way it once did. It simply exists, and you exist within it. There is no urgency now, no need to continue at a certain pace, no need to restore what is already past, only the soft presence of what remains. You notice how your movement has changed, not in what you do, but in how it feels to do it. Each action lighter, not because it has lost meaning, but because it no longer needs to carry more than itself. A step, a breath, a moment, each one complete, without needing to lead anywhere else. Within what was once shaped under Qin Shi Huang, as so much once depended on continuation, on expansion, on holding everything together against time. And now, none of that remains in the same way. But something else has stayed, something quieter, something easier to miss, but impossible to remove completely. The simple presence of being here, of experiencing what passes, of noticing what softens, what fades, and what remains for just a little longer. You do not need to understand it fully. You do not need to hold on to it. It does not ask for that. It simply appears, and then it passes. The world around you continues in small, quiet ways, fragments moving, moments forming and dissolving. Nothing building into something large, nothing pressing into something permanent. And within that, there is a kind of peace, not the kind that comes from everything being complete, but the kind that comes from nothing needing to be. The body feels this first, a softness in how it rests within itself, a sense that movement no longer needs to push against anything, no longer needs to carry anything beyond the moment it exists in. You breathe, and that is enough. You move, and that is enough. There is no longer a need to become anything more than what you are in this moment. No longer a sense that something is missing that must be restored. Because nothing is being compared anymore. Nothing is being measured against what it once was. Only what is here, only what remains. And even that does not need to remain forever. There is a gentle acceptance in this, not forced, not decided, but something that settles on its own, like a quiet surface after movement has passed through it. You feel it in the way your awareness rests, no longer searching, no longer holding, simply noticing and letting go. Not as an action, but as a natural continuation of everything that fades. Around you, there is no longer a system to observe, no longer a structure to follow, no longer something vast to move within. Only space, only time, only the soft unfolding of moments that do not need to become anything else. And in that unfolding, there is nothing missing, even if everything has changed, even if everything has passed. You remain within it, and that is enough. There is a moment, quiet and almost invisible, where everything feels complete, not because it has been built perfectly, not because it has lasted forever, but because it has been experienced, fully, gently, without needing to hold on to it. This moment does not stay. It does not need to. It passes, like everything else, and you continue. But now, there is no weight in that continuation, no direction you must follow, no structure you must remain within, only the quiet presence of moving, of being, of allowing each moment to exist, and then to soften, to fade, to rest. And as you remain within that gentle movement, no longer guided by anything beyond what is here, no longer held by anything that must continue, you begin to understand that nothing was ever meant to stay. Not in the way it once felt, not in the way it once held everything together. And that is not loss. It is simply how everything moves, through time, through experience, through you, until it becomes quiet. It is very quiet now, not empty, just quiet. You are still here, but there is nothing you need to follow, no direction, no pattern, only a soft awareness that rises and settles like a breath, slow, unnoticed. There is no need to move forward, no need to return, no need to understand what has passed or what remains, because nothing is asking to be held anymore. The space around you feels open, not wide, just unbounded, without edges, without pressure, without anything that needs to stay in place. You notice the stillness, not as something separate, but as something you are already within. There is no difference now between moving and resting, between thinking and not thinking. Everything softens, everything loosens, everything slows. You do not need to remember anything. You do not need to carry anything forward. There is nothing left to hold, and nothing left to lose, only this moment, which does not need to last. The body rests. Without trying to rest, the breath continues, without needing to be noticed. There is no effort in this, no intention, no direction, just a gentle presence that appears and fades like light through closed eyes, soft, unclear, enough. You might notice something passing, a thought, a feeling, a memory, but it does not stay, it does not need to. It moves through and dissolves without leaving anything behind. There is no need to follow it, no need to understand it, no need to hold it in place. Everything that appears softly disappears, and what remains is simply nothing pressing, nothing pulling, nothing asking. You are still here, but there is no longer a sense of here that needs to be defined. No boundary, no center, no edge, just presence that does not need to become anything else. Time feels distant now, not gone, just less important. Moments do not need to connect. They do not need to form anything. They simply exist and then fade. You do not need to notice when one ends or when another begins. There is no difference, only a soft continuation, without shape, without meaning, without effort. And even those words do not need to remain. They pass, like everything else, leaving behind nothing, and nothing enough. There's no system now, no structure, no memory that needs to stay clear, no story that needs to continue, only a quiet space that holds nothing and asks for nothing. The breath continues, the body rests, the awareness softens. Everything becomes lighter, fainter, slower, until even the sense of noticing begins to fade, and what remains is not something to describe, not something to understand, not something to hold, only a gentle, quiet, almost nothing. It is still quiet, nothing has returned, and nothing needs to. You remain. But even that feels softer now, less defined, less separate. There is no movement you need to follow, no direction you need to hold, only a gentle sense of being, without needing to be anything in particular. The breath continues, slow, unnoticed, and even that does not need to stay in focus. It fades like everything else. There is no longer a difference between what appears and what disappears. They are the same, just passing. You might notice a thought, or something like a thought, but it does not form. It does not stay. It softens before it becomes anything. There is nothing to follow, nothing to return to, nothing to understand. And that feels light, not empty, not full, just light. The space around you does not change, but it no longer feels like something around you. It feels the same as what you are. No edge, no distance, no separation, only a quiet presence. It does not need to continue, and yet it does, gently, without effort, without intention. There is no need to notice time, no need to feel it moving. Moments do not connect, they do not build, they do not lead anywhere. They simply habaneme fade into something that does not need to be named. And in that fading, there is nothing missing, nothing waiting, nothing unfinished, only what is, and even that does not need to remain. There is a softness now. That was not there before, or perhaps was always there, but could not be felt. While everything else was louder, heavier, more defined, now it is easier to simply rest without knowing that you are resting, to simply be without needing to feel that you are. And somewhere within that, very quietly, almost too small to notice, there is a sense that nothing was ever meant to be held, not for long, not in the way it once felt, and that letting it pass was never something you needed to learn, only something that happened on its own, like this, like now. And even that thought does not stay. It fades before it becomes clear, before it becomes something to remember. And what remains is even quieter than before. Almost nothing, but not empty, never empty, just still. It is almost gone, not something you can point to, not something you can follow, just less and less. There is still a sense of being here, but even that is fading, softly, without effort, without direction. There is no movement now, or, if there is, it is too quiet to notice, too light to hold. You do not need to stay with anything. Nothing is asking, nothing is waiting, nothing needs to continue, and yet something does, barely, like a breath, that no longer needs to be felt. The space, if it is still there, does not surround you, does not contain you, does not exist in any clear way. There is no inside, no outside, no sense of where you are, or where anything is, only a softness that continues until it does not. Thoughts do not form now, or if they do, they pass before they begin. There is nothing to notice, and nothing to stop noticing. It is the same either way. There is no need to rest, because there is no effort. There is no need to let go, because nothing is being held. Everything has already become lighter than it was, and now even that lightness is fading. There is no difference between this moment and what comes after or before. They do not connect. They do not separate. They simply are not anything that needs to be followed. The breath, if it is still there, is too soft to be called a breath, too distant to belong to anything. And even that is not something to notice. There is no center, no point, no place that remains. There is no need to remain. There is no need to leave. There is no need for anything to be different from this or from nothing. It is the same now. There's no word for it. and no need for one, no meaning, no absence of meaning, no feeling, no absence of feeling, only a quiet that does not stay long enough to be known. And even that begins to fade. There's nothing left to soften, nothing left to fade, nothing left to become anything else. And so, it does not, it simply ends without ending, slipping away before it can be noticed, before it can be held, before it can be remembered. There is no final moment, no last thought, no closing, no conclusion, only less and less and less. Oh.